By the summer of 1780, the British Empire believed the war for America was all but finished. Charleston had fallen in May after a long siege, its garrison of nearly 6,000 men surrendering in the single largest defeat the Continental Army had yet suffered. Savannah had been under British control for more than a year. Loyalist militias patrolled the backcountry. British generals assured Parliament that the rebellion was collapsing from within, and that soon the southern colonies would be pacified, bringing the war to a swift and decisive end. Their strategy was simple: secure the South, march north, and crush the revolution between two imperial pincers. It was a kind of thinking that made perfect sense in London's halls of power, shaped by decades of victory on Europe's open battlefields. But the Carolinas were not Europe, and the rules that governed warfare there were about to dissolve in mud and cypress water. The British army that marched into the interior of South Carolina was the most disciplined fighting force of its age. Its red-coated infantry drilled endlessly in line formations, able to load, fire, and reload their muskets with clockwork precision. They advanced shoulder to shoulder, presenting an unbroken wall of bayonets and lead. Artillery followed behind them, breaking enemy lines with thunderous volleys before the infantry closed in. It was a style of war built on order and spectacle, where victory was measured in neat formations and carefully timed maneuvers. In Europe, it had toppled kingdoms and crushed rebellions. British officers saw no reason to change a formula that had worked for centuries. The American Revolution in the North had followed this familiar script. From Bunker Hill to Brandywine, armies had faced each other across open fields, volleying musket fire until one side broke and fled. Even the great victory at Saratoga in 1777, which convinced France to enter war, had been fought with the logic of 18th century warfare. Lines of infantry clashing under banners, generals commanding from horseback, battles decided by formal engagements. To the British, the Southern campaign was meant to be no different. Loyalist militias would hold the interior. British regulars would sweep through the countryside, seize key towns, and restore royal authority. Resistance would be crushed in open battle, as it always had been. But the land itself refused to cooperate. South Carolina's coastal plains were a labyrinth of swamps, rivers, and blackwater creeks. Dense forests blotted out the sun, and humid air hung heavy with insects. Paths turned to sucking mud after summer rains. Wagons bogged down, horses floundered, and columns of infantry struggled to move more than a few miles a day. The open fields that European commanders relied upon simply didn't exist here. The terrain favored those who could move lightly and vanish quickly, and the British Army, with its long baggage trains and rigid formations, was anything but nimble. The people were no easier to control. The South was not a unified landscape of loyalist support as London strategists had believed. Small farmers, poor settlers, and backwoodsmen who had little loyalty to any distant king now watched armed men marching through their land. Some offered food or information to the British, but many more quietly aided the rebels. They provided shelter, ferried messages across rivers, and guided small bands of fighters through terrain no European officer could hope to navigate. The British Army, designed for set-piece battles and sieges, now found itself fighting a war where the enemy might never stand and fight at all. When British patrols marched confidently down narrow roads, they sometimes found themselves fired upon from the tree-line. Their attackers gone before they could respond. Supply wagons disappeared into the night. Scouts vanished without a trace, leaving only their abandoned horses tethered near the water's edge. Whole detachments marched for days in pursuit of an enemy that seemed to dissolve into the landscape itself. To men trained in the rigid codes of European warfare, it was maddening. To officers steeped in the etiquette of gentlemen's war, it was beneath contempt. They called it banditry, cowardice, a violation of every rule of civilized combat. But contempt did nothing to stop it. What the British did not yet understand was that they were facing a new kind of enemy, one who would not meet them on their terms. The revolution in the South would not be decided by grand battles or captured cities. It would be fought in the shadows of swamps, in sudden bursts of violence and long stretches of silence. It would be fought by men with no uniforms and no supply lines, who melted into the land they defended. And at the heart of it all, a quiet, wiry veteran named Francis Marion was preparing to turn the might of an empire into a liability. The British had come to fight a war of honor and formation. What they found instead was a ghost war, one they could not see, could not predict, and increasingly could not control. Francis Marion was not the kind of man most people imagine when they pictured a revolutionary hero. He was small and slight, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a thin frame and a quiet manner that made him easy to overlook in a crowd. His voice was soft, his gestures restrained, and he preferred to listen rather than speak. He was neither charismatic, like George Washington, nor fiery, like Nathaniel Greene. Yet in the tangled wetlands of the South Carolina backcountry, this unassuming man would become a figure so elusive and so maddening to the British Army that they would give him a name meant as an insult, one that would outlive them all. Marion had spent decades preparing, though neither he nor anyone else could have known it at the time. Long before the first musket cracked at Lexington and Concord, he had fought in a very different conflict, the Anglo-Cherokee War of the 1760s. It was there, deep in the forests and mountain valleys of the southern frontier, that he first learned the value of mobility, patience, and silence. He saw firsthand how indigenous warriors moved through the land like smoke, striking quickly and disappearing before their enemies could respond. They did not fight for glory or territory in the European sense. They fought for survival, using terrain, deception, and speed as their greatest weapons. Marion never forgot those lessons. By the time the Revolution reached the South, he was in his late 40s, older than most men leading troops. He had served in the colonial militia during the early years of the war, but a badly broken ankle during the siege of Charleston kept him from being captured when the city fell. It was a stroke of fortune that would shape the rest of his life. While thousands of patriot soldiers languished in British prison hulks or swore loyalty to the crown, Marion remained free, watching the tide of war shift against the revolutionaries. British control seemed absolute, yet he saw the cracks that others missed, in the loyalty of backcountry settlers, in the vulnerability of long supply lines, and the arrogance of commanders who thought they could subdue a continent with European tactics. Marion did not raise an army in the conventional sense. He gathered men the way the swamps gathered water, slowly, quietly, drawing them from scattered streams of discontent. They were not professional soldiers, but farmers, woodsmen, and tradesmen. Some had lost family to loyalist raids. Others simply hated the sight of redcoats marching through their land. They brought their own horses, their own muskets, and whatever ammunition they could find. Marion drilled them not in parade ground formations, but in the art of moving unseen, striking suddenly, and disappearing into terrain that was both shield and weapon. The swamps of the P.D. River became their sanctuary and their stage. Dense cypress stands blocked the sun and muffled sound. Tangled undergrowth and shifting water made pursuit nearly impossible for heavy cavalry or infantry in tight formation. British columns that tried to follow found themselves bogged down in knee-deep mud, their boots sucked up by the muck, their supply wagons stuck axle-deep in black water. Marion and his men seemed to appear and vanish at will, emerging from the trees to cut down an outpost or seize a supply convoy before slipping back into maze. Even when British patrols surrounded what they thought was a rebel camp, they found only cold ashes and trampled reeds. It was during one of these fruitless hunts that British cavalry commander Banastre Tarleton, infamous for his ruthlessness, gave Marion his enduring title. After chasing the partisans for over 26 miles through swamp and sand without ever catching them, Tarleton spat his frustration in a dispatch. As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him. The name was meant as mockery, but it became a badge of honor. From then on, Francis Marion was a swamp fox, the phantom who stalked British columns and vanished before they could strike back. The name spread quickly through the backcountry. Loyalist farmers whispered it in fear. Patriot sympathizers spoke it with admiration. British officers cursed it as they read yet another report of a vanished patrol or a captured wagon train. Marion himself seemed amused by the moniker, but never encouraged the legend. He had no interest in fame or glory. His only goal was to make the British occupation unbearable, to bleed them of supplies, time, and morale, until the Empire's strength became a burden rather than a weapon. To his men, Marion was more than a commander. He was a teacher and a symbol. He insisted on discipline and forbade looting or mistreating civilians, even loyalists. He treated captured enemies with unexpected mercy, often releasing them after taking their weapons. This restraint earned him both respect and trust, drawing more recruits to his cause and winning the support of civilians who might otherwise have stayed neutral. In the official reports that flowed back to London, British generals described Marion's operations as a nuisance, a minor distraction in a larger campaign. But those on the ground knew better. They knew that every lost patrol, every delayed supply convoy, and every raid on their communications was slowly draining their campaign of momentum. And at the center of it all was a quiet man on a small horse, guiding a band of farmers through the labyrinth of the PD, a ghost they could neither predict nor catch, and who would soon make the might of an empire look clumsy and blind. The fall of Charleston in May 1780 was more than a defeat. It was a collapse. The greatest city in the South, the economic heart of the Carolinas and a vital port for American trade, surrendered after 6 weeks of siege. Nearly 6,000 Continental soldiers laid down their arms, the single largest capitulation of the war. For the British, it was vindication. For the revolutionaries, it was devastation. News of the surrender rippled through the colonies like a shockwave. The Continental Army's southern command was shattered. Supplies and weapons were seized. Loyalist militias, emboldened by British victory, emerged from hiding and began settling scores with patriot neighbors. It seemed for a time that the rebellion's southern flame had been snuffed out. With Charleston under their control, British generals believed the backcountry would soon follow. Their strategy, the Southern Plan, rested on a simple calculation. The South, with its large loyalist population, would rally to the crown once the British demonstrated strength. The plan appeared to be working. British columns fanned out from the coast, seizing key towns and forts with little resistance. Savannah remained in Imperial hands. Camden fell soon after. Outposts sprouted along the rivers and crossroads of South Carolina and Georgia, flying the Union Jack over courthouses and plantations. Royal proclamations promised leniency to those who swore allegiance, and vengeance to those who did not. For many weary settlers, exhausted by years of fighting and fearful of British reprisals, submission seemed the only choice. Men who had once taken up arms for the patriot cause now lined up to take oaths of loyalty. Families who had sheltered rebel soldiers turned them away. The resistance appeared broken. British patrols marched unchallenged through towns that had once flown the banner of independence. Loyalist militias rode unchecked, raiding patriot farms, burning homes, and executing suspected rebels. In some regions, the war transformed into a civil conflict, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, with the British acting as both enforcers and arbiters of vengeance. Morale among patriot forces plummeted, with their commanders captured or scattered. Many soldiers deserted and returned home. Supply lines in the north were too long and too vulnerable to sustain large armies in the Carolinas. Continental Congress, already strained by financial ruin and internal division, could offer little help. The dream of independence, so alive in the northern colonies, flickered faintly in the humid southern air. Even George Washington, far to the north of the main army, feared the South was lost. And yet, as the British congratulated themselves on a campaign nearly won, something quiet and unexpected began to stir beneath the surface. With no armies left afield and no forts to defend, resistance did not end. It simply changed its shape. Scattered remnants of militia units regrouped in the backwoods. Former soldiers, fugitives, and angry farmers banded together. Too few to fight open battles, but too determined to surrender. They had no uniforms, no artillery, and no fixed positions. But they knew the land, every creek, every ridge, every narrow pass through the swamps and pine forests. And they knew that even a vast empire could be bled dry if it were forced to fight everywhere at once. These groups were small, often no more than a dozen men. They had no supply wagons, carrying powder and food on horseback or on their backs. They struck at night or at dawn, when British columns were most vulnerable. They ambushed patrols, seized couriers, and burned storehouses. They attacked garrisons too small to defend themselves and melted into the woods before reinforcements could arrive. What they lacked in firepower they made up for with speed and unpredictability. Each skirmish might have seemed insignificant, but together they formed a pattern, one that the British, for all their might, could not stop. The British dismissed these bands as banditti, mere criminals and outlaws. They believed such men could be suppressed with enough patrols and punitive raids. But suppression required soldiers, and soldiers were already stretched thin. Every wagon train now needed an escort. Every foraging party had to march with guards. Every post rider risked ambush. The empire's strength, so overwhelming in conventional battle, became a weakness in a war with no front lines. In this new phase of the conflict, leadership mattered less than determination. Yet leaders still emerged, men who could inspire, organize, and teach others to fight a different kind of war. Among them were figures like Thomas Sumter, who rallied backcountry militias after losing his home to British raiders, and Andrew Pickens, who turned guerrilla warfare into a science. But none would prove more influential, more enduring, or more maddening to the British than Francis Marion. He understood that the Revolution's survival no longer depended on defeating British armies in the field. It depended on denying them peace, making their control costly, and showing the people that resistance, even in defeat, was still possible. By late 1780, the British were discovering that victory on paper did not mean victory on the ground. Their banners flew over Charleston and Camden, but the countryside was slipping from their grasp. Each wagon burned, each patrol ambushed, each loyalist outpost abandoned, in fear eroded their control a little more. What had begun as scattered defiance was becoming something larger, a movement without uniforms or banners, guided by men who refused to let the dream of independence die. And from the marshy banks of the PD to the pine forests of the Santee, whispers of name were spreading. The man who had turned desperation into a weapon and proved that even a crushed country could still fight back. The force that Francis Marion assembled in the South Carolina swamps would have looked like no army the British had ever faced. It had no shining bayonets glinting in the sun, no rows of scarlet coats, no drums and fifes announcing its advance. There were no polished boots, no regimental flags, no artillery pieces pulled by teams of horses. Marion's men were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were farmers, tradesmen, millers, and hunters. Some were veterans of earlier battles who had deserted from shattered units after Charleston fell. Others were boys barely old enough to shave, riding borrowed horses and clutching old muskets. Among them were free black scouts and formerly enslaved men who had fled plantations to fight for a cause that might never recognize them. Together, they were a ragged patchwork of humanity, united not by rank or uniform but by a shared refusal to surrender. What they lacked in formality, they made up for in adaptability. They had no supply lines stretching hundreds of miles, vulnerable to ambush or weather. Their ammunition came from captured depots or whatever they could cast themselves. Their food was drawn from the land, game hunted in the forest, fish pulled from the rivers, corn traded from sympathetic farmers. There were no payrolls, no elaborate chains of command, no waiting for orders from distant headquarters. When Marion decided to strike, they rode out within hours. When the British moved against them, they scattered into the swamps, vanishing as if the earth itself had swallowed them. To British officers schooled in European doctrine, they were little more than bandits. They broke every rule of civilized war. They attacked without warning and disappeared before they could be engaged. They refused to stand and fight in open battle, slipping away before artillery could be brought to bear. They struck in places no army was supposed to fight, in swamps and forests, at river crossings and narrow bridges, in the dead of night or the gray light of dawn. They did not wear uniforms, and so they were often dismissed as rabble. Yet this rabble was costing the British dearly. Marion trained his men to fight differently from the moment they joined him. He taught them to use the terrain as a weapon. They learned to move silently through the cypress stands and palmetto thickets, to fire from behind trees and vanish before their smoke cleared. They practiced firing, reloading, and mounting in one fluid motion, so they could strike and flee with equal speed. They drilled in ambush tactics, not formal lines of musketry, but carefully timed volleys from concealed positions, designed to break enemy formations before they even realized they were under attack. Every man knew the land intimately, which streams were fordable after rain, which paths were passable by horse, where a column of infantry would have to slow to cross a causeway. The swamps were their fortress, and they fought as though the land itself was on their side. The diversity of the force was its greatest strength. Runaway slaves and free black scouts, often dismissed by both sides, became Marion's eyes and ears. They knew back roads, river crossings, and the hidden trails no British map recorded. They slipped behind enemy lines, listening for troop movements or locating vulnerable supply convoys. Teenagers on swift ponies served as messengers, darting between villages and camps to relay orders before British patrols could intercept them. Former Continental soldiers taught new recruits how to load faster, aim straighter, and fight under pressure. Even farmers who had never fired a musket before the war learned to reload in the dark and fire from horseback. The result was not a standing army, but a living, breathing organism, one that adapted constantly to the enemy's movements and needs. They also fought with desperation the British could not match. For many, this was not just a war for independence, but for survival. Some had seen their homes burned by loyalist militias. Others had watched neighbors hang from trees as examples. Black men among Marion's ranks fought not just against a foreign king, but against the system of bondage itself. Their motivation was deeper than orders or pay. It was personal, and it gave them a ferocity that professional soldiers could not always understand. When they struck, it was not for glory or territory, but to make an occupying army bleed. Because they had no discipline in the traditional sense, they were free from many of the constraints that slowed conventional armies. There were no supply wagons to guard, no cumbersome artillery to transport, no formal lines that needed to stay in formation. They traveled light and could cover 50 miles in a day if needed. They could strike two outposts hundreds of miles apart within a week and vanish into the backcountry before the British even realized the same force was responsible. They could surround patrol with 20 men, inflict heavy losses, and disappear before reinforcement arrived. Every movement was calculated to frustrate, exhaust, and confuse. British generals continued to underestimate them, insisting that such irregulars could never change the outcome of the war. Yet every raid, every ambush, every supply convoy destroyed proved the opposite. The British could win battles. They had the numbers, the training, the cannons. But Marion's men were fighting a different kind of war, one where battles were relevant. Their victories were measured not in territory taken, but in the time, money, and manpower the British wasted trying to chase them down. In this new kind of war, there were no uniforms and no rules. Only the relentless pressure of a people determined to make occupation impossible. And with each raid from the shadows, the myth of British invincibility eroded a little more. The first time the British truly understood what Francis Marion's war would look like was on the banks of the great PD River. It was early autumn of 1780, the air thick with humidity and the heavy sweetness of rotting cypress leaves. The river wound lazily through the lowlands, its black waters hiding roots and snags beneath the surface. Spanish moss draped from the trees like hanging curtains, and the ground itself was treacherous. Firm one moment, a sucking mire the next. It was no place for a conventional army to move, which is precisely why Marion had chosen it. Word had reached him that a British patrol, perhaps 20 men strong, was moving north from Georgetown to escort a supply wagon. They had grown confident, even careless. The months following Charleston's fall had taught them to expect no resistance outside of formal battles, and they had begun to march as if the land already belonged to them. Their muskets were slung casually over their shoulders, their coats damp and heavy in the southern heat. To them, this was routine, another patrol in a conquered province. To Marion, it was an opportunity. He had only 12 men with him that day, a small detachment of his growing band, armed with an assortment of muskets, fowling pieces, and pistols. Most wore homespun shirts and leather leggings. A few had hats turned up on one side, mimicking the Continental style, but there were no uniforms to speak of. They carried no drums, no flags, no bayonets. What they did have was knowledge of the land, of their enemies' habits, and of how to turn both to their advantage. They moved before dawn, riding silently along narrow deer trails that wound through the cypress grove. Horses were tethered miles away. They would make their escape on foot. Marion led them to a bend in the road where the tree line pressed close, and the ground dipped into a shallow hollow. Fallen logs and thick underbrush provided perfect cover. From there, they could see the road clearly but remain invisible themselves. Once in position, they waited. An hour, then two, listening to the drip of water from the canopy and the distant calls of birds waking in the swamp. Late in the morning, the British appeared. First came the scout on horseback, riding slowly and scanning the tree line with disinterest. Then the column itself. A file of redcoats marching in loose formation, bayonets glinting dully in the filtered light. The supply wagon creaked behind them, pulled by a pair of oxen. There was no advance guard, no flankers in the woods. They believed themselves safe. Marion raised his hand. The men cocked their muskets in near silence, careful not to betray their position. He waited until the patrol was deep inside the kill zone, then dropped his hand. A thunderous volley shattered the morning calm. Smoke billowed from the tree line as lead tore through the air. The British column buckled under the sudden assault. 2 soldiers fell instantly. A third stumbled screaming into the road. Confusion rippled through patrol as they scrambled for cover that wasn't there. They fired blindly into the trees, hitting nothing but shadows. Before they could rally, a second volley crashed from the opposite side of the road. Marion's men had split into 2 groups, creating the illusion of a much larger force. Panic spread quickly. Officers shouted orders that no one heard. Men dropped their muskets and bolted into the swamp, only to sink knee-deep in mud or vanish into thickets of palmetto. Within minutes, discipline dissolved into chaos. Marion gave a short whistle, the signal to withdraw. His men melted back into the forest, moving with the speed and silence of ghosts. They did not stay to loot bodies or capture prisoners. That was not the point. Their purpose was disruption, to show the enemy that nowhere was safe, that every road could become a battlefield without warning. Within half an hour, the clearing was empty again. The only evidence of the ambush was a supply wagon abandoned in the road, a few bloodstains darkening the earth, and scattered bits of cartridge paper fluttering in the humid breeze. When British reinforcements arrived hours later, they found nothing to fight. The bodies of their fallen comrades had been stripped of ammunition, and the wagon's contents were gone, distributed among Marion's men or hidden for later use. The attackers had vanished into the swamp, leaving no trail that regular cavalry could follow. Horses balked at the deep mud. Infantry slogged forward only to find footprints that disappeared into waist-high water. Frustration boiled over. Officers cursed the cowardly tactics of their unseen enemy, calling them savages and criminals. But behind their anger lurked something more dangerous: fear. News of the ambush spread quickly through British ranks. Soldiers who once marched confidently along country roads now glanced nervously at every tree line. Officers tightened formations and demanded heavier escorts for even the smallest patrols. Entire columns slowed their advance, wary of invisible enemies. The swamp fox, once dismissed as a nuisance, was now a real threat, and the great PD ambush had shown just how dangerous he could be. For Marion and his men, it was more than a victory. It was a message. They did not need thousands of troops or formal battles to shape the course of the war. A handful of determined men, armed with knowledge of the land and a willingness to fight on their own terms, could wound an empire. And as they disappeared deeper into wetlands, leaving only silence behind, that message echoed louder than any cannon. To understand Francis Marion's genius, one must first understand what he refused to do. He never sought to hold ground, never believed in defending territory for its own sake, and never allowed himself to be pinned down by a stronger enemy. In a war where victory was usually measured in battles won and cities captured, Marion measured success by a different standard: survival, disruption, and confusion. His greatest weapon was not his musket or his horse, but his ability to vanish, to dissolve into the land so completely that the British could not strike what they could not find. Every lesson Marion learned in his earlier frontier campaigns came into play now. The British, steeped in the traditions of European warfare, believed that battles decided wars. They marched to seize towns, built forts to secure territory, and forced their enemies to meet them in the open. But Marion understood that to fight on those terms was to lose. His men were too few, too poorly equipped, and too lightly armed to stand against disciplined lines of redcoats and bayonets. If they stayed in one place, they would be surrounded and destroyed. If they tried to defend ground, they would be crushed under the weight of artillery. So he chose a third option. He would never be where the British expected him to be. After every ambush, Marion's men dispersed like smoke. They did not linger to gloat over their victories or occupy the ground they had fought on. They scattered into the forest, broke into smaller groups, and vanished into waterways and hidden trails that no British officer could map. Sometimes they would ride 50 miles in a single night, crossing rivers and disappearing into swampland. Sometimes they would split into pairs, each heading in a different direction, regrouping days later at a rendezvous point no enemy could predict. Even if the British managed to follow their tracks, they would find them ending abruptly at the edge of a cypress stand or fading into the dark waters of a creek. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them. The effect on British strategy was profound. Commanders sent cavalry detachments racing down country roads to intercept Marion, only to find nothing but abandoned campsites and smoldering fire pits. Infantry columns marched for days through oppressive heat and biting insects, hacking their way through swampy thickets, chasing rumors of rebels who had moved on days before. Entire weeks were wasted in fruitless pursuits that yielded not a single battle. Frustration turned to rage. Officers began to speak of Marion not as a man, but as a phantom, a ghost who struck without warning and then vanished into thin air. One of the most famous of these pursuits was led by Banastre Tarleton, the same British cavalry commander who had derisively nicknamed him the Swamp Fox. Determined to end Marion's campaign once and for all, Tarleton set out with 250 well-mounted dragoons, certain that superior numbers and speed would finally corner the elusive rebel. Marion responded by leading him on a chase that defied belief. Through tangled forests, across marshy creeks, and into trackless swamps, Marion's men lured Tarleton's cavalry deeper and deeper into hostile terrain. After 26 grueling miles of pursuit, the British commander was forced to give up, his men exhausted and his horses collapsing from exhaustion. Tarleton, humiliated, could only admit bitterly that the devil himself could not catch this man. But Marion's vanishing act was more than a tactic of evasion. It was a psychological weapon. British soldiers grew paranoid, scanning the tree line with every step, never sure if an ambush was waiting. They began to distrust the very roads and rivers they had relied on to project power. Supply convoys that once moved freely now required heavy escorts, slowing the pace of operations. Garrison commanders, uncertain of where Marion might strike next, spread their forces thin, leaving themselves vulnerable elsewhere. Even loyalist militias began to fear venturing too far from British protection, knowing that Marion's men could appear from nowhere and melt away before help arrived. The vanishing also allowed Marion to strike where he was least expected. Because his men carried no baggage and depended on the land for sustenance, they could move swiftly and unpredictably. One week they would raid a supply convoy near Georgetown. The next, they would appear 100 miles away, torching a loyalist outpost on the Santee. The British could not anticipate their movements because there was no pattern to predict, no front line, no fixed base, no territorial ambition. Marion understood that the goal was not to seize ground, but to make the enemy believe they controlled none. This approach bewildered and infuriated the British High Command. In their reports to London, they described Marion's tactics as ungentlemanly and barbaric, insisting that such methods were beneath the dignity of a proper army. But their words betrayed a deeper truth. They were fighting a war they did not understand. Marion's refusal to fight by their rules rendered their overwhelming strength useless. Cannons were useless against men who never built walls. Bayonets were meaningless against foes who never lined up to receive them. Numbers meant little when the enemy scattered and reformed like mist. In this war of disappearance, every absence was a victory. Every abandoned road was a battlefield won. And every British column that returned to camp empty-handed was proof that the Empire's might could be outmaneuvered by shadows. For Francis Marion, vanishing was not retreat. It was domination by another name, a relentless pressure that wore the enemy down without ever giving the satisfaction of a decisive fight. And as the months wore on, it became clear that the Swamp Fox was not just avoiding battles. He was rewriting the very meaning of how wars could be fought. By late 1780, Francis Marion understood that killing British soldiers was not enough to win the war. The Empire had more men, more muskets, more ships, and deeper coffers than the revolutionaries could ever hope to match. For every patrol he ambushed, another would soon take its place. For every officer who fell, another would arrive from London to replace him. If the rebellion was to survive, the British war machine itself had to be starved. And so Marion shifted his focus from fighting men to attacking the arteries that fed and sustained them. The lifeblood of the occupation, food, ammunition, communication, and transport, became his new targets. The British campaign in the South relied on a vast and vulnerable network of supply lines. Wagon trains rolled along narrow dirt roads from Charleston to Savannah, carrying crates of gunpowder, flour, salt, and medical supplies to isolated outposts deep in the Carolina interior. Flat-bottomed river barges drifted up the Santee and the PD, laden with barrels of rum, uniforms, spare muskets, and nails for repairing wagons and fortifications. Dispatch riders galloped between posts, carrying orders from one garrison to the next, their messages essential for coordinating troop movements. Without this constant flow of supplies and information, the redcoats could not feed their soldiers, maintain their weapons, or plan their campaigns. Marion knew that even a single successful raid could set their entire system back by weeks. His men began to stalk these routes with the patience of hunters. Scouts slipped through pine forests and swamps, watching roads for days at a time to learn when convoys passed and how many guard they carried. Local sympathizers sent word of scheduled shipments or troop movements. When the moment was right, Marion's band struck. They did not need to destroy every wagon or capture every boat. Hitting even one could leave an entire garrison undersupplied and vulnerable. One of their most famous raids came in early November. A convoy of 5 wagons carrying gunpowder, rations, and replacement muskets was moving from Charleston to a fortified post near Nelson's Ferry. It was lightly guarded, perhaps a dozen soldiers, because British commanders believed the route secure. At dawn, Marion's men slipped into position on either side of a wooded stretch of road where the path narrowed between a swamp and a steep embankment. As the lead wagon entered the kill zone, a blast of musket fire tore into the escort. Horses reared, men scattered, and chaos spread instantly. Within minutes, the redcoats surrendered. Marion's men seized dozens of muskets, several barrels of powder, and sacks of flour. The horses were taken too, and the wagons set ablaze. When the smoke cleared, the road was empty, and a British garrison 20 miles away would now have to ration its food and ammunition for weeks. Other operations were even bolder. At night, Marion's men boarded small boats and drifted silently downriver, intercepting British supply barges under the cover of darkness. They captured messengers and burned mail pouches before the dispatches could reach their destinations. Bridges and ferry crossings were destroyed, forcing British columns to march miles out of their way or delay their movements entirely. The disruption was relentless. A supply chain designed to operate with precision was now forced to function under constant uncertainty. Each attack had an effect far greater than the immediate loss of goods. British garrisons that once lived comfortably now struggled to stretch their rations. Soldiers grew hungry and demoralized, and disease spread in camps weakened by poor nutrition. Ammunition shortages forced officers to limit patrols and postpone offensive operations. Most damaging of all was the breakdown in communication. Orders that once took a day to travel now took a week. Reinforcement arrived too late to support threatened outposts. Units moved in isolation, unaware of each other's positions. An army that had once seemed unstoppable was now lumbering and blind. The psychological impact of these raids was perhaps the most devastating blow. British officers found themselves forced to commit more men to guard duty, weakening their offensive strength. Supply convoys that had once required a dozen escorts now demanded 50. Communications that had been routine now required coded messages and heavily armed couriers. Every precaution cost time, and every delay gave Marion more opportunities to strike again. The empire that had boasted of its reach now found its grip loosening. For Marion's men, the raids were not just about denying the enemy supplies. They were about arming the revolution. Captured muskets were repaired and redistributed. Powder and shot were carefully divided among militia bands. Seized food was shared with starving patriot families who had risked everything by supporting the rebellion. In this way, every British loss was a double blow. It weakened the occupiers and strengthened those who resisted them. By the winter of 1780, the British Army in South Carolina had begun to feel the slow strangulation of Marion's campaign. They still held the cities, the forts, and the main roads, But their control was increasingly hollow. A garrison with no food could not march. A regiment without powder could not fight. An army cut off from its orders could not win. And all the while, somewhere out in the swamps and pine forests, the swamp fox and his men were watching, waiting, and preparing to cut the lifeline again. By the beginning of 1781, Francis Marion had become something more than a nuisance to British commanders. He was a ghost story, told in letters, whispered in taverns, and repeated around campfires. His raids had disrupted supply lines, shattered patrols, and humiliated some of the most capable officers in the British Army. Yet it was not the scale of his victories that mattered most, but the sense of helplessness they created. An empire that prided itself on order and control suddenly found itself chasing shadows through the swamps of the Carolinas. And the longer they failed to catch him, the more his legend grew. The first signs of that legend appeared in the words of those who hated him most. Officers who had spent their careers crushing rebellions and policing far-flung colonies now wrote home in tones of deep frustration. The devil himself could not catch this man, one of them fumed, echoing the sentiment Banastre Tarleton had voiced after his exhausting and fruitless pursuit. In dispatches to London, generals complained of an enemy who refused to fight properly, who would not stand and be destroyed. They described raids that came from nowhere, convoys that vanished without a trace, and patrols that never returned. They described a man who seemed always to know their movements before they made them, a man who struck like a phantom and disappeared into the swamp before the dust had settled. The British press, reading these accounts, turned Marion into a figure of both irritation and reluctant respect. Colonial newspapers, meanwhile, transformed him into something more, a symbol of defiance. In Philadelphia and Boston, editors printed dramatic accounts of his raids, often exaggerated but always inspiring. They describe how a handful of ragged militiamen had captured convoys guarded by dozens of soldiers, how British outposts had been overrun in minutes, how redcoats had fled into the night, terrified by an enemy they could not see. The swamp fox, as Tarleton's insult had dubbed him, became a household name, part man, part myth, and a living example of what resistance could achieve. The psychological effect on British troops was impossible to ignore. Soldiers once confident in their superiority now marched with unease. Every tree line was a potential ambush. Every bend in the road might conceal hidden muskets. The swamps they had dismissed as impassable were now places of terror, dark, silent, and full of unseen eyes. The mere rumor that Marion's men were nearby was enough to halt a patrol or delay a convoy. Even veteran officers began to doubt their ability to control the countryside. They could occupy towns, build forts, and march along roads, but they could no longer claim to rule the land in between. The legend had an equally powerful effect on the civilian population. In the aftermath of Charleston's fall, many colonists had accepted British rule as inevitable. They had taken loyalty oaths, paid taxes to Crown, and tried to rebuild their lives under occupation. But Marion's defiance and his continued success began to change that. People who had once resigned themselves to British authority now whispered stories of his exploits. They spoke of the small, wiry man who appeared out of nowhere, punished the oppressors, and vanished before retribution could follow. They marveled at how a handful of farmers and fugitives had forced the world's greatest military power to chase ghosts. And with every story, hope rekindled. Some of these former loyalists quietly began aiding the rebellion. They provided food, information, and shelter to Marion's men. Others took up arms themselves, joining local militias or forming guerrilla bands of their own. Entire communities that had once flown the Union Jack now refused to cooperate with British troops. The occupation, which had seemed so stable after Charleston's fall, was now riddled with resistance. Resistance fueled not by orders from Congress, but by the example of one elusive man in the swamps. Marion himself did nothing to encourage his growing legend. He did not court publicity, did not seek titles or recognition. He rarely wrote reports, and when he did, they were brief and factual. But the very absence of self-promotion made the stories around him grow even larger. People filled in the blanks with imagination. Some claimed he could ride 50 miles without rest. Others swore he had spies in every British camp. Still others insisted he was never wounded, that musket balls could not find him in the swamp shadows. None of it was true, and none of it mattered. What mattered was a belief that he could not be caught. By the spring of 1781, the British found themselves in a strange and dangerous position. They still held the South's major cities and forts, but their control of the countryside was slipping through their fingers. Columns marched endlessly, chasing an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Morale fell. Supply lines frayed. Even the most disciplined soldiers looked over their shoulders as they marched. And all the while, the legend of the swamp fox grew, a legend born not of size or power, but of the simple truth. The empire could not defeat what it could not catch. By 1781, the war in the South had ceased to resemble anything the British Army had prepared for. The clear battle lines and decisive set-piece engagements that had defined European warfare were gone, replaced by something shapeless, unpredictable, and maddening. Francis Marion and his men had transformed the Carolina backcountry into a labyrinth of shifting dangers, a place where there were no fronts, no secure flanks, and no safe rear areas. Every road was a potential ambush site, every bridge a trap, every water source a possible death sentence. The British were fighting a war without battlefields, against an enemy that refused to play by any of the established rules. The collapse of traditional warfare began with the smallest acts of sabotage. A bridge that had stood for decades might suddenly give way under the weight of a supply wagon, plunging oxen and cargo into the river below. A road long used by British patrols could be blocked overnight by fallen trees, or made impassable by deliberate flooding. Marion's men cut telegraph lines of communication, or more often, they captured or killed the riders themselves, leaving orders and intelligence to rot unread in the mud. The redcoats, trained to march and fight in neat formations, now spent their days hacking through brush, rebuilding bridges, and guarding every mile of road against invisible enemies. The destruction of infrastructure was only part of the strategy. Marion's men targeted the very resources the British relied upon to survive in the field. They raided storehouses and torching supplies before they could reach frontline units. Grain destined for garrisons was burned in its wagons. Mills were destroyed, forcing the British to haul flour over greater distances. Even water, so abundant in the swampy lowlands, became a weapon. At several points, Marion's men fouled wells and poisoned streams, forcing troops to carry water in barrels or risk disease. These tactics might not have caused mass casualties, but they inflicted something just as damaging: exhaustion. Soldiers grew weaker, horses fell ill, and entire units were slowed to a crawl. The cumulative effect was suffocating. British commanders found themselves reacting constantly, shifting troops to guard supply depots, escort convoys, and rebuild what had been destroyed. A single raid might delay a regiment's movement for a week. A burned bridge could reroute an entire column, stretching their march from days to weeks. Garrison commanders began hoarding supplies rather than sending them forward, fearing they would be intercepted en route. The logistical machine that underpinned British military power, a system that had conquered continents, was now choking on its own complexity. The British could not simply ignore these attacks. Every bridge mattered. Every shipment mattered. Every rider carried orders that could determine the fate of a campaign. Yet responding to every incident stretched their resources thinner and thinner. Hundreds of soldiers who might have been used in offensive operations were now tied down as guards, engineers, or patrolmen. Cavalry units once meant for battlefield charges were reduced to chasing rumors of militia sightings. Even elite regiments spent their days escorting wagons rather than engaging enemy armies. It was as if the British had been drawn into a slow, invisible siege, one they could neither break nor win. For Marion's men, this form of warfare required patience and discipline. They struck quickly and retreated before the British could retaliate. They avoided large engagements and refused to defend captured supplies or territory. Their goal was never to hold ground, but to make the enemy's presence in that ground untenable. Every fire they set, every bridge they toppled, every supply line they severed was part of a larger campaign, one that aimed not to destroy the British Army outright, but to wear it down piece by piece until it collapsed under its own weight. The most remarkable part of this transformation was how it reshaped the geography of power. At the start of the campaign, Britain's control of the South had seemed absolute. They held Charleston, Savannah, and the major rivers. Their garrisons dotted the countryside, and their patrols moved freely. But as Marion's campaign of sabotage intensified, those vast spaces grew smaller and more treacherous. British control shrank to the ground beneath their boots and the walls of their forts. Beyond that, in the forests, swamps, and backroads, the Empire's authority was little more than an illusion. Even British officers, steeped in centuries of imperial confidence, began to admit the scale of the problem. In reports of their superiors, they described a war in South Carolina as an unending harassment and a battle fought in shadows. They could no longer predict where the next blow would fall or how to prevent it. Marion's men had no capital to capture, no headquarters to bombard, no army to corner and destroy. They were everywhere and nowhere, a diffuse, relentless presence that gnawed at the British war effort from within. It was not the kind of war that won glory or yielded spectacular victories. It did not fill newspapers with triumphant headlines or produce dramatic battles, but it was effective. It turned the British Empire's greatest strengths, its size, its resources, its dependence on logistics, into vulnerabilities. And with each burned bridge and sabotaged wagon train, the mighty red-coated army found itself trapped in a tightening net, struggling to fight a war it no longer understood. By the time British commanders decided to strike back at Francis Marion, their patience had long since run out. His raids had humiliated them, his ambushes had crippled their supply lines, and his very existence had become a symbol of imperial weakness. They needed a decisive blow, a clear victory to restore their authority and silence the whispers of defeat that were spreading through the Carolinas. And for such a task, they turned to one of their most feared officers, General Banastre Tarleton. Tarleton was already infamous on both sides of the Atlantic. Young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless, he had carved a bloody reputation across the southern colonies. American troops despised him for his brutality at the Waxhaws, where his cavalry cut down surrendering soldiers without mercy, an act that earned him the nickname Bloody Tarleton. To British command, however, he was precisely the kind of man needed to crush a guerrilla leader like Marion. Aggressive, relentless, and unafraid of harsh measures, Tarleton seemed the perfect weapon to end the Swamp Fox's reign of terror. In November 1780, Tarleton assembled a strike force of roughly 250 elite dragoons and loyalist cavalry and set out with one mission: to find and destroy Marion. His orders were simple: no negotiations, no quarter. He would chase Marion down, force him into open battle, and annihilate his band of irregulars once and for all. Confident in his superior numbers, speed, and discipline, Tarleton believed victory was inevitable. He had defeated conventional patriot forces in the past. Surely a ragtag militia would prove no challenge. But Marion had no intention of giving him the kind of fight he wanted. The Swamp Fox knew that a head-on engagement against Tarleton's cavalry would be suicidal. Instead, he planned to fight the only way he knew how, not by fighting at all, but by vanishing. As Tarleton's men thundered into the backcountry, Marion and his militia slipped ahead of them, never more than a few miles away, but always just out of reach. They moved silently through pine forests and along hidden trails, their horses light and sure-footed compared to the heavy British mounts. Whenever Tarleton thought he had them cornered, Marion vanished into swamps, where thick mud and waist-deep water slowed cavalry to a crawl. The chase stretched on for days. Tarleton's men rode hard, covering mile after mile under the blistering Carolina sun. They crossed rivers, hacked through tangled forests, and pressed deeper into terrain that was as hostile as it was unfamiliar. Marion used every trick he knew to stay ahead, doubling back along narrow trails, splitting his forces to confuse pursuit, and disappearing into waterways where hoofprints vanished beneath the surface. At one point, Tarleton's men believed they had driven the rebels into a dead end, only to discover that Marion's band had slipped across a flooded swamp during the night, leaving the exhausted dragoons staring helplessly at the impassable water. The pursuit became a grueling test of endurance rather than a battle. Tarleton's soldiers, burdened with heavy gear and unfamiliar with the sweltering humidity, began to falter. Horses stumbled and collapsed. Men grew sick from heat and exhaustion. Their rations ran low, and water became scarce. Yet Marion continued to lead them deeper into the wilderness, always just far enough ahead to stay out of reach, but close enough to keep them chasing. Over the course of 26 punishing miles, Tarleton's force was pushed to the brink of collapse, all without ever firing a shot. At last, Tarleton was forced to abandon the pursuit. His men were too exhausted to continue, and their horses could go no farther. Frustrated and humiliated, he turned back toward British lines, having accomplished nothing. Marion, meanwhile, emerged from the swamps almost untouched. His band had suffered no casualties, lost no supplies, and gained something far more valuable than a battlefield victory: the knowledge that even the most feared cavalry in the British army could be rendered powerless by terrain, patience, and cunning. News of Tarleton's failure spread quickly, further cementing Marion's reputation as a master of irregular warfare. The British had thrown one of their best commanders at him, and he had beaten them not with superior numbers or firepower, but with time, distance, and exhaustion. Soldiers who had once mocked Marion's cowardly tactics now understood their effectiveness. Civilians who had doubted the patriot cause saw in the swamp fox a figure who could humble even the empire's deadliest warriors. For Tarleton, the pursuit was a bitter lesson. All his training, discipline, and aggression were useless against an enemy who refused to fight by conventional rules. And for the British command, it was a grim warning. Marion could not be destroyed by brute force. They could chase him for miles, burn villages, and hang captured partisans. But as long as the swamps offered him sanctuary and the people offered him support, the swamp fox would remain beyond their reach, a phantom that could never be caught. By 1781, Francis Marion's campaign had settled into a relentless rhythm, a drumbeat of disruption that never let the British rest. His men had no interest in occupying towns or planting flags. Their mission was simpler and far more effective. They would strike, vanish, and strike again. At dawn, their muskets cracked in the mist, catching British patrols off guard. By noon, they were gone, their trails swallowed by the swamps. By dusk, they were already preparing for their next attack, somewhere miles away. This pattern repeated itself over and over, until the British found themselves fighting not an enemy they could see, but shadow that slipped through their fingers no matter how tightly they tried to grasp it. A typical raid began with information. A courier intercepted, a loyalist sympathizer bribed or persuaded, a message quietly passed along by a farmer whose family had suffered under British occupation. Once Marion knew where his enemy would be, he moved swiftly. His men rode under cover of darkness, traveling miles through back roads and forest trails to position themselves by dawn. They struck hard and fast, often before their targets even knew they were in danger. A supply convoy might be ambushed as it crossed a narrow bridge, its wagons set ablaze and its guards scattered. A small garrison could wake to find its boats gone, captured overnight by Marion's men and used to ferry partisans across the rivers. In some cases, they captured prisoners, not for ransom or exchange, but for intelligence, squeezing every detail they could about British movements and plans before releasing or relocating them. The raids rarely lasted more than an hour. Marion never lingered long enough for British reinforcements to arrive. As soon as the job was done, he and his men melted back into the wilderness. They traveled lightly, leaving behind no heavy equipment to slow them down, no wounded to care for, no loot to tempt pursuit. By the time British troops reached the site of an ambush, the Swamp Fox's band was often a dozen miles away, moving deeper into the tangled marshes where horses could not follow and artillery was useless. The redcoats often found only smoking ruins, empty wagons, or footprints that disappeared into muddy water. Individually, each of these actions seemed insignificant. A few wagons burned, a bridge destroyed, a handful of prisoners taken. None of them were decisive blows in the traditional sense. They did not win battles or capture cities. Yet together they were devastating. They disrupted the British supply chain, forcing garrisons to ration food and delay operations. They sowed fear and uncertainty, making soldiers reluctant to march without heavy escorts. They slowed communications, leaving commanders blind to developments in the field. And they exhausted the enemy, both physically and psychologically, as weeks of fruitless pursuit drained their morale and their will. The British soon realized they were being bled dry. Every raid forced them to divert men and resources away from offensive operations. Every destroyed bridge had to be rebuilt, every captured boat replaced, every stolen weapon accounted for. Patrols that might have been used to secure the countryside were instead assigned to guard convoys. Entire regiments were mobilized just to protect supply routes. The occupation, once a symbol of imperial strength, began to look increasingly fragile as Marion's relentless harassment stretched British forces thinner and thinner. The constant raids also undermined British authority in the eyes of the people. Occupation relies on the appearance of control, the sense that the occupying force is omnipresent, unchallengeable, and absolute. Marion shattered that illusion. Each successful strike reminded ordinary colonists that the British were not invincible, that resistance was still possible. Communities that had once accepted British rule began quietly aiding the partisans. Farmers had food and ammunition from Marion's men. Blacksmiths repaired their weapons. Families offered shelter and secrecy. With every raid, the network of support grew stronger, feeding a movement that the British could neither contain nor crush. For the men who fought under Marion, the rhythm of hit and fade became second nature. They learned to sleep in short bursts, to march silently through night, to fire, reload, and vanish before a single counter volley could be organized. They developed an instinct for the land, knowing which creeks would flood after rain, which trails would remain firm under a horse's hooves, which islands offered safe refuge from pursuit. Their lives were measured not in weeks or months, but in the cycle of preparation, attack, and withdrawal that defined their fight. By spring, the British were no closer to defeating Marion than they had been months before. They had chased him across counties, built forts to block his movements, and launched punitive expeditions into the swamps, all to no avail. The swamp fox remained free, his men as elusive as ever, and his campaign of attrition continued unabated. Each raid, each ambush, each disappearing act chipped away at the Empire's strength. And though the British still held their cities and their forts, they no longer truly held the countryside. There in the forests and the wetlands, Marion ruled, not as a conqueror, but as a relentless force that refused to yield, bleeding an empire one strike at a time. At first, Francis Marion's band of partisans was little more than a handful of determined men, a loose circle of farmers, deserters, and hunters bound together by necessity and desperation. They slept under trees, shared whatever food they could find, and relied on instinct more than strategy. But as their successes grew, so too did their ranks, their reach, and their sophistication. By 1781, what had begun as a small guerrilla force had transformed into something far greater, a living, breathing network of resistance that stretched far beyond Marion's immediate command. It was no longer just a band of raiders. It was a movement, decentralized, adaptive, and deeply rooted in the land and the people who called it home. The transformation did not happen overnight. Each successful ambush, each captured supply train, and each narrow escape made the Swamp Fox's legend grow, and with that legend came trust. Farmers who once feared British reprisals began leaving sacks of corn and smoked meat hidden under brush along known partisan trails. Blacksmiths secretly repaired captured muskets and hammered horseshoes for Marion's riders. Planters who outwardly appeared loyal to the crown quietly offered shelter in their barns and information on troop movements overheard from visiting officers. The swamps themselves, once considered inhospitable wastelands, became sanctuaries where Marion's men could rest, regroup, and plan their next strike. Free black scouts and formerly enslaved men became indispensable to the network's operations. They knew the backwaters and hidden trails better than any map ever drawn, guiding Marion's raiders through channels that could not be followed and marshes that swallowed whole any attempt at pursuit. They listened carefully to conversations in towns, plantations, and British camps, passing on valuable intelligence about patrol schedules, supply routes, and weak points in enemy defenses. Their knowledge of the land and their ability to move unnoticed made them the eyes and ears of the resistance, extending Marion's reach far beyond his immediate surroundings. Women, too, played a crucial but often invisible role in this expanding web. They carried messages between Patriot sympathizers disguised as ordinary household work. A swatch of fabric hanging from a clothesline might signal the presence of British patrols nearby, while the pattern on a quilt could map out safe routes for partisans to follow. Even pie crusts baked for church gatherings sometimes contained coded designs, indicating where supply cache was hidden or where a courier would pass. These signals, undetectable to the untrained eye, allowed information to flow freely under the very noses of British officers. Communication was the lifeblood of this movement. Couriers, often young boys or old men who attracted little suspicion, carried messages tucked into saddlebags or sewn into clothing. Word of a British convoy could travel from one end of a county to the other within a day, giving Marion time to mobilize and strike. Information about enemy troop strength, plans, or supply shortages flowed constantly through this informal network, allowing Marion to plan his raids with a precision that belied his small numbers. The British, accustomed to thinking of warfare in terms of armies and fortifications, had no answer for an intelligent system woven into the fabric of everyday life. The deeper this network grew, the harder it became for the British to suppress. Burning villages did little to stop the flow of information. Hanging suspected partisans only fueled resentment and strengthened local resolve. For every farm they raided or family they punished, two more offered their support to resistance. The British could occupy territory, but they could not occupy loyalty. The real battlefield was no longer the ground beneath their boots, but the hearts and minds of people. And there, Marion was winning. By now, Marion's men rarely operated alone. Other militia leaders, inspired by his success, formed their own bands and coordinated their attacks. Partisan groups hundreds of miles apart began timing their raids to strike simultaneously, overwhelming British defenses and scattering their resources. Outposts that had once seemed secure were now vulnerable from every direction. Garrison commanders who thought they were facing a single enemy suddenly found themselves beset by dozens, each operating independently, yet connected through shared purpose and silent communication. The result was a resistance that could not be easily mapped or measured. It had no central headquarters, no formal chain of command, and no single point of failure. It was a network of families, communities, and individuals, some who had never fired a shot, but whose contributions were no less critical than those who did. Together, they made Marion's campaign larger than himself, larger even than the men under his direct command. The British could capture or kill a commander, but they could not capture the will of an entire people. By the time British generals realized the scale of what they were facing, it was too late. Marion's war had grown far beyond the swamps and forests where it began. It flowed through rivers and roads, through kitchens and workshops, through whispered conversations and coded signals. It was everywhere and nowhere, a movement woven into the very fabric of the South. And it was this invisible army, more than muskets, more than cavalry, more than cannons, that made the empire's hold on the region weaker with every passing day. By the spring of 1781, the British found themselves in a situation they had never anticipated. When they first marched into the southern colonies, they had expected swift and decisive victories, a pacified countryside, and loyalist support that would stabilize their rule. Instead, they were trapped in a slow-motion collapse, bled by a war they could neither predict nor control. At the heart of this unraveling was Francis Marion and the insurgency he had built. His relentless campaign, a chain of ambushes, raids, and acts of sabotage, had gradually tightened around British operations until the empire's grip on the interior was little more than illusion. The effects of Marion's strategy were everywhere. British garrisons that had once confidently manned outposts deep in the countryside were now isolated and vulnerable. Supply convoys could no longer move without heavy escorts, slowing the delivery of food, ammunition, and mail to a crawl. Patrols that once roamed freely now huddled behind palisades, fearful of venturing far from their forts. Even the most hardened loyalist militias, who had once terrorized patriot communities, found themselves harried and hunted, their homes burned, their numbers dwindling. The British still held Charleston, Savannah, and a handful of key towns, but their authority outside those walls was evaporating. Loyalist garrisons were the first to break. Isolated and undersupplied, many abandoned their posts altogether, retreating toward larger, more defensible positions. Dozens of small forts, once symbols of imperial control, were left empty or captured by local militias. Some were torched by their own defenders to prevent them from falling into patriot hands. Each withdrawal ceded more territory to the insurgents, who quickly filled a vacuum, taking control of crossroads, ferry points, and key waterways. With every abandoned outpost, British control of the interior shrank further. The logistical nightmare grew worse with every passing month. A convoy that once needed a dozen men to guard it now required 50 or more. Even then, it was not guaranteed to arrive intact. Marion's men were everywhere, striking with unnerving precision. They cut off wagons, seized horses, captured supplies, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. British officers tried rerouting their convoys, but Marion adapted, learning their new routes and striking again. Each lost shipment compounded the problem. Troops in remote outposts went hungry. Ammunition dwindled. Communication broke down as couriers were intercepted and messages destroyed. The Empire's vast resources meant little if they could not reach the soldiers who needed them. For General Charles Cornwallis, commander of British forces in the South, the situation was untenable. He could not garrison every town, guard every road, or protect every shipment. His only option was to concentrate his forces, to pull troops back from the interior and focus them on defending the cities and major strategic positions. It was a sound decision from a tactical standpoint, but it was a disaster for a war of occupation. By withdrawing from the countryside, Cornwallis effectively conceded control of it to the rebels. Patriot militias, no longer challenged by regular troops, spread across the region, recruiting new fighters, consolidating supply lines, and building local governments. In many places, British authority ceased to exist altogether. The withdrawal also had devastating political consequences. Many loyalists who had thrown their lot in with the crown felt abandoned and betrayed. They fought alongside British regulars, burned patriot farms, and risked their lives for a cause that now seemed unwilling to protect them. Without British support, many fled their homes, while others switched sides, deciding that their survival lay with rebellion. The collapse of loyalist morale was a blow from which British strategy in the South would never recover. Perhaps the most profound change, however, was psychological. British troops, once the embodiment of imperial power, now seemed reactive and defensive. Instead of dictating the terms of the war, they were responding to events, constantly forced to react to Marion's movements and anticipate his next strike. Instead of projecting dominance, they were retreating behind walls and fortifications. Every mile they surrendered, every outpost they abandoned, eroded their aura of invincibility. And with every retreat, patriot confidence grew. Marion's success did not exist in isolation. His campaign created the conditions that allowed larger continental forces under Nathaniel Greene to operate more effectively. Greene's army, moving through territory softened by months of guerrilla warfare, found a countryside increasingly friendly to their cause. Supply lines were easier to maintain, local militias provided vital intelligence, and British forces, stretched thin and demoralized, were easier to outmaneuver. The combined effect of Marion's insurgency and Greene's conventional campaigns transformed the war in the South from a British offensive into a grinding defensive struggle. By late 1781, the British still held their strongholds, but they had lost the one thing that mattered most in a war of occupation: control of the people and the land between them. Marion's campaign had exposed a truth the Empire had never fully grasped: that holding cities and winning battles was meaningless if you could not govern the countryside. What began as a few scattered raids had become a strategic disaster, one that forced Cornwallis into desperate decisions and set the stage for the final unraveling of British power in the American South. Even as the war in the South shifted back toward larger, more conventional battles, the British never truly escaped the shadow of Francis Marion. By early 1781, the Continental Army, bolstered by Southern militia and French support, began confronting British forces head-on once again. The battles of Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse showed that disciplined American troops, properly led, could stand against seasoned redcoats in open combat. And by the time the decisive siege at Yorktown unfolded later that year, the war's momentum had clearly swung toward independence. Yet even amid these more traditional clashes, one persistent reality haunted British commanders: they had never solved the Swamp Fox problem. Marion's force, elusive, unpredictable, and immune to conventional defeat, continued to operate in the shadows until the very end. This was no small irritation. Even as Cornwallis's army maneuvered against Nathaniel Greene's in the Carolinas, Marion's raids continued to sever communication lines, seize supplies, and keep loyalist militias in a constant state of disarray. British columns marching toward major battles were forced to divert troops to guard their flanks and secure their supply routes, slowing their movements and weakening their strength. Reinforcements that might have tipped the balance in a conventional engagement often arrived too late or not at all, delayed by partisans who appeared from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished again before they could be countered. Marion's presence in the field meant that the British were never fighting a single war. They were fighting two at once, one in the open and one in the shadows. His tactics continued to shape the character of the war even after Yorktown. Long after Cornwallis's surrender, small bands of British troops and loyalist militias still struggled to hold isolated outposts in the southern backcountry. Marion's men harassed them relentlessly, ensuring that even as the peace negotiations began, the British could claim no real control beyond their fortified positions. The lesson was impossible to ignore. An empire that could crush armies and capture cities could still be worn down by a foe who refused to fight on its terms. This lesson would echo far beyond the swamps of South Carolina. Marion may not have set out to invent a new way of waging war, but his methods would become a blueprint for countless insurgencies over the next 2 centuries. His core principles: strike where the enemy is weakest, refuse to meet him where he is strongest, and disappear before he can retaliate, would be studied, adapted, and refined across the world. In Latin America, guerrilla fighters facing imperial armies and foreign-backed regimes would adopt similar tactics, choosing mobility, surprise, and local support over conventional strength. In Africa and Asia, resistance movements fighting colonial powers learned that they did not need to defeat their enemies outright. They only needed to make occupation too costly and too exhausting to sustain. Even in the jungles of Vietnam, nearly 2 centuries later, the echoes of Marion's campaign could still be heard. In the hit-and-run ambushes, the sudden raids, and the enemy's maddening ability to melt back into the landscape, the British themselves, for all their global power, struggled to adapt to this new reality. Their armies were built for decisive battles and territorial conquest, not for hunting elusive partisans through hostile terrain. Their doctrines emphasized discipline, formations, and firepower, all of which meant little against opponents who refused to fight by the book. They could win battles like Camden or Eutaw Springs, but they could not destroy the insurgency that made those victories meaningless. Marion's war had shown that the traditional calculus of strength, numbers, artillery, wealth, could be overturned by knowledge of terrain, local support, and unyielding patience. Even after the Revolution ended, Marion's legacy remained deeply woven into the American military tradition. The partisans who fought under him went home with the knowledge that small groups of determined people could stand against empires. Future American commanders, from the frontier wars to the Philippines, studied his campaigns as models of irregular warfare, and revolutionary movements around the world drew inspiration from the way he had turned weakness into strength and chaos into strategy. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Marion's legacy, however, was psychological. He proved that control on a map was not the same as control on the ground. He showed that an occupying force could hold cities, ports, and major roads and still fail to rule the land itself. He demonstrated that a war could be lost not through defeat on the battlefield, but through the slow erosion of authority, the steady bleeding of will, and the relentless pressure of a people who refused to yield. That was the lesson the British never learned, and one that would haunt every empire that followed them. When the Revolution finally ended and the British flag came down, Marion returned quietly to civilian life. He never sought fame or reward. Yet his legacy endured long after the musket smoke cleared, not as a monument or a statue, but as a set of principles that reshaped the nature of warfare itself. The Swamp Fox had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a cannon or a regiment, but the simple refusal to fight on the enemy's terms, and the patience to win a war that the enemy cannot even understand. In the official histories of the American Revolution, the grand moments often take center stage. Washington's crossing of the Delaware, the French fleet's arrival at Yorktown, Cornwallis's surrender beneath a white flag. These were decisive events, pivotal in shaping the course of the war and the birth of a new nation. Yet beneath those celebrated victories lay another, quieter story, one without grand armies or gleaming battlefields, a story written in the mud and shadows of the Carolina swamps. It was there, far from the gaze of diplomats and generals, that an empire was humbled not by overwhelming force, but by will, patience, and imagination. Britain entered the war with every advantage an imperial power could possess. It commanded the most formidable navy on earth, a seasoned professional army, immense financial resources, and a global empire capable of supplying men and material from every corner of the world. Its officers were trained in the art of European warfare, massed infantry formations, devastating artillery barges, disciplined cavalry charges. Against it stood a fledgling nation with no standing army, a weak central government, and militias composed largely of farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen. By every conventional measure, the outcome should have been inevitable. Yet the war did not unfold according to those calculations, because men like Francis Marion refused to let it. Marion understood a truth that the British never fully grasped. Wars are not won by firepower alone. They are won by understanding the ground beneath one's feet, by knowing how to turn weakness into strength, and by refusing to fight on terms set by the enemy. His campaign demonstrated this principle with ruthless clarity. He did not attempt to match British regiments musket for musket or march his militia into the mouths of their cannons. Instead, he fought where they were vulnerable and vanished where they could not follow. He turned rivers into escape routes, forests into fortresses, and swamps into deadly traps. He transformed supply lines into targets and isolation into opportunity. Every raid, every ambush, every vanished patrol chipped away at the Empire's strength, draining its resources and eroding its will. What made Marion's war so powerful was not its scale, but its persistence. He proved that victory did not always require destroying an enemy outright. Sometimes it only required denying them peace. Britain could win battles, seize cities, and occupy territory, but none of it mattered if they could not control the land between their outposts or the people who lived upon it. Marion and his men showed that occupation was a fragile illusion, one that could be shattered by a handful of determined individuals who refused to accept defeat. They made the British pay for every mile they marched, every wagon they moved, every order they tried to deliver. And in doing so, they forced the most powerful empire in the world to realize the limits of its might. The deeper lesson of Marion's campaign extends far beyond the American Revolution. It is a lesson that would echo in countless struggles to come, that even the most imposing force can be brought low by those who know how to fight from the margins. The same principles that allowed a ragged band of militiamen to outmaneuver British regulars in the Carolina backcountry would later guide resistance movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Empires with armies and fleets would find themselves undone by people with little more than determination and knowledge of the terrain. The story would repeat itself again and again, in jungles, deserts, and mountains, but its roots lay here, in the damp and tangled swamps where the swamp fox made his stand. In the end, Britain was not defeated solely by the brilliance of Washington's strategy or the might of French intervention. Those elements were vital, but they alone could not have secured independence. The revolution endured because of countless small acts of defiance: bridges burned, supply wagons stolen, dispatches intercepted, carried out by men and women who never wore uniforms and never stood in ranks. Francis Marion's campaign embodied that spirit. He showed that courage was not measured by the size of one's army, but by the refusal to yield. That power was not only in cannons and fleets, but in creativity and patience. That victory belonged not just to those who commanded armies, but to those who knew how to disappear into the shadows and make the enemy fear the dark. When the war ended and the British sailed home, they left behind not just a lost colony, but a lesson that would outlive their empire. That strength alone cannot conquer people who understand their land, their purpose, and their power. The world's mightiest army was humbled not by grand victories or overwhelming force, but by small bands of ordinary people, farmers and fugitives, scouts and spies, who fought without banners, without formations, and without recognition. In their persistence, Britain's empire found its limits, and in their defiance, a new nation found its birth.